about what over the last couple of days, weeks? Forgiveness. And today I want to have a look at another aspect of forgiveness. And I want to start by telling you the story of a man who has been described as one of the greatest examples of forgiveness outside of the Bible. How would you like to have that description said about you? That's pretty impressive. His story has been retold in the book and the movie of the same title that came out in 2014, Unbroken. Louis Zampanini was a young American who was destined for greatness. He was an athlete and he was preparing for the 1940 Olympic Games. He was a sprinter. But when America joined the war in the early 1940s, he gave up his sprinting career and he joined the army because he felt that that was a patriotic thing to do. And he was actually stationed in the Pacific as part of the crew of the B-24 bombing things. One very fateful day, his plane crashed. He was actually going out searching for other people that had crashed, and they ended up crashing themselves. Everybody in the crew died, except for Zampanini and two others. For 47 days, just think about that, 47 days, they were on a lifeboat floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No land around. They had managed to catch a few fish to eat and got some rainwater so that they survived. One of the guys died, but two of them survived. And then they were rescued by the Japanese. From there, their bad dream became an absolute nightmare. They suffered months of starvation, disease, psychological trauma, unimaginable living conditions, daily abuse at the hands of sadistic and brutal guards. And they reduced Zampanini to the shell of what he had once been. The regular and on-the-going assaults of Zampanini are just too horrific. I'm not even going to go there. But one of the guards particularly, known as the Bird, persistently and cruelly targeted Zampanini for punishment. One of the few things that kept him alive during this time was the thought of murdering these guards. He had such hatred for them. In fact, he was actually part of a plot to try and kill some of the guards in there. And they went, we know that the price of killing the guard will be our life, but that would be worth it. Amazingly, he survived. And he got home to America. And you would think, okay, his nightmare is over. But all that trauma stays with you. And he developed post-traumatic stress disorder. He had revolting nightmares every night that had him waking up screaming. And so he turned to alcohol to solve his problems because it dulled the pain. Couldn't keep a job. His family, that had been incredibly close before he'd gone to Japan, was a mess. You know, he was single-handedly destroying them. He was a broken man in a downward spiral. Then one day his wife went to a Billy Graham crusade. And against a lot of hostile resistance from him, she convinced him to come along with her the next night. That night came and he placed his faith in Christ. And in one night his nightmares disappeared. His desire for alcohol was totally gone. And he fully and completely forgave his captors. The very people that he dreamt about killing, he was able to say, I have forgiven them. But it didn't just stop there, because in 1952 he went back to Tokyo for a speaking tour. And he had the opportunity to meet with the prisons in the forgive my pronunciation, the Sugamo prison, which was filled with 850 Japanese war criminals. And amongst them were the guards that had been guarding the camp that he had been at. And after speaking to all the prisoners in general, Louis had requested to meet his former guards personally. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from his diary. It says, "I looked out and I saw them coming down the aisle. And of course I recognised each one of them vividly. I didn't even think about my reaction. I jumped off the stage, ran down, threw my arms around them, and they withdrew from me. They couldn't understand forgiveness. We went into the room, and there, of course, I continued to press the issue of Christianity. You see, and all but one made a decision for Christ that day. One of the Japanese soldiers said, 'How could you forgive us men that have treated you so badly?' And this was Louis' response. He said, 'Well, Mr. Sasaki, the greatest story of forgiveness in the world ever known was the cross. When Christ was crucified, he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And I said, it's only through the cross that I can come back here and forgive you." You know, over the last couple of weeks when we've looked at forgiveness, and we started off looking at, well, what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. And then last week we looked at forgiving ourselves and you know, not holding on to that burden. Today I want to have a look at this next bit, that of forgiving our enemies. And to do it, I want to turn to Matthew 5, verses 43 to 48. It says, "You have heard that it was said, love your enemy and love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to shine on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you only greet your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect." Let's start at the beginning of this passage. Jesus gives them a very well-known saying in their time. The saying was, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. And you know, many people in our world today, they would still agree with that statement. If we went out and talked to the people in the shopping centre and said, is it okay to love your neighbour and hate your enemy? They would go, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. They believe that we need to be nice to those that are like us, but that's the end of the story. We don't have to be nice to anybody else. But let's ask a really simple question. Who is my enemy? The Bible talks about who is my neighbour, but who is my enemy? R.T. Kendall says that the enemy is anyone who wants to harm you or would say something about you as to call your credibility or integrity into question. They would rejoice at your downfall or lack of success. They would not pray that God will bless you, but sincerely hope that God would bring you down. An enemy is someone who hates you. But sometimes they won't always admit to hating you. Hate is a very strong word. They might not say, oh, I hate that person. But they might say something like, I loathe that person. Or I despise that person. Or I can't stand being around that person. You know, it's not, I wouldn't say I hate that person, but I can't stand being around that person. They just make me sick. You know, the enemy may not try and hurt you here in New Zealand today with a gun or a knife, but they can deliberately use words, both verbal and written, to bring you pain. And you see this all the time. You hear things that people have said to each other and go, what is that? Facebook is dreadful for it. That people write the horriblest things on Facebook. But God says that we are to love and pray for those that are our enemies. And there may be times that you want to shout out to them, yes, God, please send a big hailstorm down right on top of them. That's not what he's talking about. We are to love them and pray blessings upon their life. And that is exactly the opposite of what you feel like doing with an enemy. To someone that you loathe and despise and find it hard to be nice to. You don't feel like doing that. But once again, we see that forgiveness is not about feelings. Remember, and this has come through time and time again, that forgiveness is not about feelings. It is a choice that we make. You need to choose to love your enemies. You need to choose to love those people that, frankly, you may not even like being around. So how do we do that? God says, love your enemies. Pray for those. You know, what's the first bit? I tell you to love your enemies. What does that look like? Okay, so here's what it looks like. First of all, really simple, be pleasant to them. Like, you want me to be pleasant to that person in my office that is just always revolting to me? And God would go, yes, I want you to be pleasant to them. I want you to decide that you're not going to engage in the put-downs that they might be doing, and you're not going to give tit for tat. You're going to be pleasant with them. You're going to go in and say, good morning, how was your day? That might turn around and backfire on you. I've had it turn around and backfire on me. But keep doing it anyway. Secondly, if a conversation happens and you have an opportunity to set them free from some of their guilt, do it. You know, guilt is really painful, and we can easily punish other people by just sending them on their guilt trip. And yeah, we talked about this a bit last week. But choose never to do that. And that can be really hard because I can get a little bit of satisfaction sometimes out about seeing how bad you're feeling about this. Or seeing how badly you're doing. I'm glad that you're hurting too. You hurt me. I'm glad that you're hurting too. But remember, in the same way that God doesn't want you to hang on to your guilt and beat yourself up over things that you've done, he doesn't want the other person to do that either. So if you have an opportunity to speak and say something that is going to relieve them of some of their guilt, do it. You know, remember last week we talked about Joseph, and he's telling his brothers to stop being angry at themselves. This is the attitude that we need when we're dealing with our enemies. Not only do we need to forgive them, but we need to be able to help them forgive themselves. And we can go a step further than that. We can help them to feel good about themselves. Often when we consider people to be our enemies, and we don't like being around them, we find it difficult to say nice things to them. It's difficult to say, hey, you did a great job doing that. Or I really appreciate the fact that you put in all this extra time doing this. Or congratulations, for getting that promotion. Sometimes we'll say those things to people that we like, but to our enemies, to the people that we struggle with, they can do something fantastic. I'm not going to give them any credit for it. They're a horrible person. Do you know even horrible people can do something fantastic? But if we have an opportunity to speak good and blessings into their life, then that's what we should be doing. Fourthly, keep it up. Today, tomorrow, the next day, The next day, the next year, keep going and going and going. Remember, forgiveness is a choice. I'm going to choose to forgive you. You have to choose to forgive your neighbour. And I am not saying that this is easy. Because while you are choosing to forgive Jane may be still sprouting out all this venom and everything towards you. And God goes, I want you not only to forgive her, but I want you to love her. And I want you to pray for her. And that is tough. But that is what God's asking us to do. Remember when Peter said to Jesus, how many times do we need to forgive? What was the answer? 70 times 7. So do I need to be mathematical and go 490 times and then I can cross it off? No. It's keep going. Keep going. Keep forgiving. Keep saying, I need to forgive this person. And, often it is only through the strength that God gives us that we can do this. It is not through our strength at all. And finally, pray for them. Pray for blessings on their life. Pray that you can find a way to come alongside them and form that relationship with them. Pray that they can find God. Going to Japan wasn't the end of Louis Zampanini's story. Years later, while he was there, he actually asked them what happened to the bird. And they called him the bird because they were too scared, because if he ever found out that they were talking about him. So they called him the bird, so that way he didn't know what they were talking about. They asked him what happened, and they thought that he had committed suicide at the end of the war. Years and years later, he found out that he hadn't. He wrote him this letter, and I want to read it to you. To Moshishiro Watanabe. As a result of my prisoner of war experience under your unwarranted and unreasonable punishment, my post-war life became a nightmare. It was not so much due to the pain and suffering as it was a tension of stress and humiliation that caused me to hate with vengeance. Under your discipline, my rights, not only as a prisoner of war, but also as a human being, were stripped from me. It was a struggle to maintain enough dignity and hope to live until the war's end. The post-war nightmares caused my life to crumble. But thanks to a confrontation with God through the evangelist Billy Graham, I committed my life to Christ. Love has replaced the hate I had for you. Christ said, forgive your enemies and pray for them. As you probably know, I returned to Japan in 1952 and was graciously allowed to address all the Japanese war criminals at the Sugamo prison. I asked them about you and was told that you probably had committed hari-kari, which I was sad to hear. At that time, like the others, I also forgave you and now would hope that you would also become a Christian. Louis Zampanini. Watanabe never accepted that letter. Actually, he read it, but he refused. Louis Zampanini had asked to go and speak to him, and he refused to go and speak to him. He refused to have that forgiveness that was being offered to him. Louis Zampanini is a fantastic living day example. No, he's not living anymore. He died a couple of years ago. But he was a fantastic example of what this Bible verse is all about. And it cannot be done in our own strength. This was done through the power of Jesus Christ. And if there is anybody out there who is struggling with unforgiveness and hate for an enemy in any way, shape or form, then I want you to come forward at the end of this service today and receive prayer. Because what God did for Louis Zampanini, God can do for you. We don't have to carry this round anymore. We don't have to be chained by this. God will help us, will strengthen us to forgive. You know, as we come to communion, the verse that says, Christ died for us while we were his enemies. He didn't wait for us to come to him first. He died for us while we were still his enemies. And as I think about these elements, this is how much Christ loved us, that he allowed his body to be broken. That he offered up his blood as a sacrifice for all mankind. Not when we were his friends, but when we were his enemies.